Okay, I'm going to show you how to connect your project to Git and GitLab. The thing to understand about Git is that there are two pieces to it. One is a local repository, which you can always have regardless of whether there's a remote one like on GitLab or there are other places like GitHub. So what you do first is to establish a local repository. And the way to do that is to right-click on your project at the top of the project and select versioning and initialize Git repository. Notice that there are two other options. One is Mercurial, that's another version control system. Subversion is yet another, that's an older one. Git is the one that is the most popular with open source, and it has functionality that goes a bit beyond some of the others. And regardless, that's what we use, and that's what GitLab is going to require. Again, you don't need to be connected to GitLab to do this, but we just say initialize Git repository, and it says select where it should be created, and in this case, it'll be just where your directory is. And notice that the output file gives what the command prompt would have given. As I mentioned, basically almost everything that we do using a graphical user interface really has under the hood a command prompt type of thing. So this is what it did. It said initializing repository, and it created it here in our directory, and then it initialized it, and we're finished. Now notice that something has changed, namely that our green, the name of the class has changed from black to green, and in general, actually, in this case, they're all green. We can see what is now. The thing to understand is that we are now just dealing with the local Git repository, and we can see what the state is by again right-clicking. And now instead of versioning, we have Git show up, and then there are a number of different options. We'll be exploring some of these, but if we say show changes, then what comes up are all of the changes relative to what the local Git repository is. The color key is green is for something that's been added but not committed. When we commit it, it will show up as black. When we start editing our files, then an edited file will show up as blue. Okay, so now, but we don't want to commit just yet in this particular case because we want to first make the connection with the remote. If we try to commit first, then it turns out that there are issues that they're all resolvable, but it gets a little confusing, and it's just easy to kind of mess things up. So really the next thing that we want to do is to connect it to our GitLab repository. So log into that. I need to find it. Okay, here. Now mine is called CS2173 class code. Yours will be just CS2173 period. Now, here is the clone. To connect to a remote repository, we actually, they use the word clone. We're actually going to use something called pull. Now, there are two possibilities. We can clone with SSH or HTTPS. If you know how to use RSA public keys, then you can figure out how to do this. It takes a little bit of dancing. The easiest thing would be to simply log on with your NPS credentials, and that will use HTTPS. And with this link here, we can simply copy the URL. And having done that, we go back to NetBeans. right-click at the very top of your project. You want to do this at the very top because you want to get everything in there. And we say Git Remote Pull. And the next thing here is that we want to specify a Git repository location. Currently, there's nothing there. But if we simply paste in, and again, on a Mac I use Command V. On a Windows, you would use Control V. And we see that it pastes in our GitLab URL. Yours should look like the same up to here. This should be the same for you. https://gitlab.nps.edu. Here should be your NPS username. This is mine, but yours should be yours. And then yours should be simply CS2173. Mine says class code because that distinguishes my repository from yours, and that just leads to less confusion, believe it or not. Okay, so just paste in what you had copied before. Now we want to give our username and password. All right, and now if you're comfortable with this, we can click Save Password, and that way we won't have to keep typing it in each time. If you're not comfortable with that, then don't save it and then type it in each time. Okay, so again, just to check, we have our GitLab URL. Make sure yours has your username and simply CS2173, not with the class code, your username, your password for NPS, that's your NPS login, and save password, and we go to next. And here is the, okay, now master, the remote branch is this, and what this does is this connects the origin master branch on GitLab to your local one right here. And when we click finish on that, then now notice that nothing has changed in our files because we have not committed them. And actually neither Git nor GitLab has any idea about them. And just to double check, we can look at the files in our repository, and they're simply they're simply the README. Hopefully you created the README. If you didn't create the README, there might be a problem doing this first pull. It just has something to do with the way GitLab works. So if you have created that README, then you're good to go. Now with this, just to double check what we've done here, again, right click on the project, say Git, and then under here, repository browser. And what that will give you is information about your local and your remote. So branches, everything is in a branch. And if we open up branches, we see there's local and remote. So the local branch is called master. The remote branch is called origin/master. And what these numbers here are, these are commit hashes. If they are the same, that means that as far as your local Git repository goes, it is consistent, it is in sync with the remote. If they're different, then that means that they're out of sync. We'll kind of deal with that later. Now, as far as remotes go, if we open up remote, we see that here's origin, and it lists it. Just double check that this is the URL for your GitLab. So now notice that this is your HTTPS, and then this is your username at gitlab.nps.edu/ and then your user again, and then the name of your repository. Okay, so now how can we get stuff up to GitLab? There are two steps. First is we commit it locally, and then we push it to the remote. So to commit locally, first I want to verify that all of the changes that I've made are ones that I'm comfortable with, and if that's the case, yeah. Now notice this here. Notice that on the, if I hover here, it says I'm on the branch master. That's because ultimately we can be on. There are different branches. We're probably not going to get into that this quarter, but it says contain added, modified, or deleted files, and so that indicates that the local Git repository is not in sync with the changes that have been made. And again, when we looked at the changes, see that these are in fact the changes that have happened. Now there are two ways to commit. Actually, one of the easiest is right here. There's a little button to the very right. It says commit changes, and when we click on that, we see that it lists all of the changes, and these are all the files that have been added. These other files, like this build.xml and all these others, these are NetBeans files that it creates, and it's a good idea to commit them, just because when you pull from somewhere else, then the project will be all set up. So we'll just say initial commit of not hello world. And that's pretty much all we had. Your commit message should not be too verbose. It should be just enough to say, okay, what was this about? Why did you do this? All right, now, assuming everything is in order, we can commit. Now, just notice over here, we can exclude files from the commit if sometimes that comes up. Usually that won't be the case, but it occasionally happens. All right, so now we commit. Now notice that there are no head or working tree changes. Our file names have changed from green to black, and that indicates that in fact they are in sync with the local repository. So notice now it does not say that there are added or modified files. However, let's go back to the repository browser and take a look at the difference between our local and remote branches. Now, notice that now our local master branch has a different hash than the remote, and that means that they're out of sync. In this particular case, that means that the local is ahead of the remote. Now, how can we do something about that? Well, that's where a push comes in. We want to push our changes to our GitLab. Again, almost everything is right-clicking at the top of the project, and we say Git, remote, push. Remember, we did a pull to begin with? Now we're going to do a push. So push me, pull you. And notice that the push, we have a configured Git repository location, so we don't have to type all that stuff in again. Say next. Now, okay, so here's like a little check. Our local branch is going to update the master. And the remote branch is going to be updated by the changes that have been made to our local one. So that's just verify that U is there. If you see a red C, that means there's a conflict, and that means that additional things should be, additional steps need to be taken. Hopefully that won't happen. If that does happen, there'll be another information about how to deal with that. But for right now, everything is copacetic. And now, see, we're pushing. Again, this is a network task. Now notice that here on our repository browser, our master and our remote both have the same hash, and that means that they're in sync. And we can verify that by going back to our GitLab on the web Okay, now it doesn't look like anything has changed, but if we just refresh the page, we see that the files that we had committed from our NetBeans, the build and the various other things here. So here are the source files. We can navigate this. Here's our not hello world that we had and this is how we can actually kind of browse things on the web. We can't really, well, it's not recommended to change things there. Okay, just to summarize, what we have done is we have initialized our local Git repository. We've committed our what we've added to our local. Then let me retract as far as the order goes. First, we initialized our local Git repository. Then we pulled a remote repository from GitLab, and that kind of made the connection. Then we committed our local files, and then we pushed them to GitLab, so that now everything I've done locally is available remotely. And this is how you will ultimately submit your programming assignments.